Okay, welcome everyone to my continuation of what are my favorite theorems, my very biased collection, as usual. Today, actually, a collection of theorems related to growth of groups. So, growth of groups is kind of an old topic in, well, group theory, geometric group theory, maybe. But it got quite popular in the 80s, where kind of some of the main questions were settled. And I'm kind of trying to talk about what happened since the 80s, and there's still a lot of open questions and conjectures, and it's not as well understood as you would like it to be. And basically, it's about very small groups, whatever that means, we'll see. Very big groups, whatever that means, we'll see. And the crazy ones, the medium-sized groups, whatever that means, we'll see. So let's get started. Here's some kind of version of geometric group theory. And in geometric group theory, you always look at some Cayley graphs. So as a reminder, what Cayley graphs are. So just take a group, like here, my symmetry group of the hexagon. So can I draw a hexagon? I can, and it's generated by two elements, a symmetry group. There's an order 6 element, which is just a rotation. I call it A. And there's an order, well, what is it? 2 element, which is just a reflection in a hyperplane, in this case, in a line, which I call B. And this is a presentation. And the Cayley graph is basically the action graph of the group with respect to this presentation. And that just means the following. So you draw a graph whose vertices are the elements of the group. So this should have 12 vertices, because it's the symmetry group of the hexagon, which has 6 rotations, and then the reflections. So 6 times 2 is 12. And it's actually very nice in this case, the Cayley graph. So it's just the hexagon on the outside, in the front, and the hexagon in the back. So A here is the green one, and B here is the blue one. And it's made as follows. So every vertex corresponds to an element of the group, and the action of A is illustrated by the, well, greenish arrow. So if I'm here and I call this element X, then this would be AX, and this would be BX. So blue is B. So this is how it looks like. It has a rotation in the front, it has a rotation in the back, and they're related by reflections. So B is a self-dual because, well, whatever, it's its own inverse, and that's why this is kind of a double edge pointing in both directions. But usually those Cayley graphs are oriented. So this is X, and this is AX, and this is actually A inverse X. Right? If from A inverse X by left multiplication by A, I go to X. Right? So this is usually how the Cayley graph works. But what I would like to discuss today, I want a symmetric version of the Cayley graph. And this just means I take A inverse as well as a generator. I would need to take B inverse as well, but it turns out that in this case, B inverse is B. And this is just saying I consider the same graph, but I disregard the orientations. So it's the same graph, but without orientations. And now it actually looks really nice. Now it just has a hexagon in the front, a hexagon in the back, and it's related by those blue edges. So it's kind of I don't know, this shape certainly has a name. Absolutely. So that's what I want to do. So I have a Cayley graph of a group, just the elements, so the vertices are just the elements, and the edges are just given by acting with your favorite choice of generators. By the way, the generators will always kind of play an implicit role in the background, but in the end, it doesn't really matter. So as long as you have a generating set, all I'm going to say will roughly be the same anyway. So let's not worry about generating sets. I just warn you that the Cayley graphs for different generating sets will look very different, but still the overall result is the same. So let's ignore it. Anyway, so we have this Cayley graph. Vertices are the group elements, and now we can move around in the Cayley graph because it's a graph, right? So that's what we want to do, and that's what we would like to use or will use to define what the growth is of a group. So I take the Cayley graph of a group. So in this case, it's just the Cayley graph of our a very simple group is Z squared. So how can the Cayley graph of Z squared look like? Well, every element is a vertex, whatever AB, right? So it's given by AB, and you can go from AB to all of its neighbors by adding +1, for example, A plus 1B in this direction, or adding +1 here. So it would then be A, B plus 1, and so on. So it's just, in other words, it's just a grid That's it. And because we don't consider orientations, it's really just a grid. And that's it. And what we would like to do is we like to kind of measure distance in this grid, in general, in the Cayley graph. So I define here the growth of the group with respect to a fixed Cayley graph, with respect to a fixed generating set. All of this won't play a role, so let's ignore it, as the growth rate of a certain function. And it is a following function. It's exactly the function I illustrate here. It starts at the origin is somewhere, and you draw a small ball around the origin. And it should contain all vertices of distance, well, 1 or 0, depending on a little bit how you want to count. Let's say 0 from the origin. So it's just the origin. In the next ball, I would like to have all vertices that are of distance 1. And distance here is just a step in the Cayley graph. So just one edge away. They are of distance 1 away from the origin. And if I haven't miscounted, well, this is just 1, and this should be 5. So 1, 2, 3, 4, and the middle one, 5. They're all at most 1 step away. That's the correct framework. At most 1 step away, right? This vertex, you need 2 steps, so it will show up in the next one, but not in the previous one. And then you go on. So distance 0, distance 1, distance 3, distance, well, I should include distance 2. Distance 0, distance 1, distance 2, distance 3, and so on. And you get a function from the natural numbers to the natural numbers, and the growth rate, I call it f, the name doesn't matter, and the growth rate of this function is the growth of the group. So here's the next one is, if I haven't miscounted, 13, and the next one, well, we can try. So here's another vertex, here's another vertex, here's another vertex, here's another vertex, and it would be this little bubble here. And as you can see, it's +4, +8. I guess the next one would be +12. So it should contain 25. Well, we already have 13. And then 14, 15, 16, 17, 18, 19, 20, 21, 22, 23, 24, 25. Ooh, I haven't discounted. That's great. So 25. So it's +4, +8, +12. The next one is +16, and so on. And that's kind of the growth rate you get here is polynomial. It's just n squared. It's of order n squared in this case, right? So every step, you just increase the growth rate here is of order n squared. So it has polynomial growth. In general, z to the k is of order n to the k, which is still polynomial growth, right? So the growth function here is of polynomial growth. If you wonder, well, we are kind of doing geometric group theory. So from the viewpoint of geometric group theory, finite groups are always pretty boring. So finite groups have constant growth. Why is that? Well, I don't know what the Cayley graph of my finite group is. It's some crazy graph, but it's for sure finite. That's what makes it a finite group. So at one point, I will have a ball which just contains the whole graph. And from there onwards, it just contains the whole graph. So the growth is not very exciting. It's constant. Okay. So here are 2 examples. Finite groups, constant growth. These abelian groups, these z to the k, polynomial growth. And you might wonder, is there anything else? Or is polynomial growth the worst, or the only thing that you can get? So constant growth is, let's count it also as polynomial growth. It's a very special form of polynomial growth. And you do the same, let's say, for the free group. And you will see actually that the growth in this case is roughly 2 to the n, which doesn't look very polynomial anymore. So it's exponential. So for k bigger than 1. So the free group with 1 generator is a bit boring. And this is just growth rate n. So that's still polynomial. But from k bigger than 1 onwards, you get the exponential growth. And that's, again, easy to see if you walk around the standard Cayley graph of this beast, which looks like this fractal here. And the fractal is a fractal in a fractal, basically. So at each step, it kind of doubles the amount of vertices you see. So you start at 1, the next one will be 4. Actually, it will always be 5. I was miscounting here, and it didn't actually count the middle one. So the next one will actually already be 5. And then 16 new vertices in the next step. So it should be whatever, 21 maybe, and so on. So definitely, I just counted here. Kind of silly mistake, let me say it again. This is just what you add as new vertices, which clearly is some 2 to the n nonsense. And if it's a 2 to the n nonsense, it's certainly not polynomial anymore, right? So it grows exponential. Okay, in other words, we have seen now for finite groups, there was constant growth. These are kind of some small groups. Polynomial, also small groups. Let's call polynomial small groups. And then we have the big groups, which grow exponentially. And you might wonder, what about something in between, which is not polynomial, which is super polynomial, but not exponential, which is less than exponential? Does any kind of group of that form actually exist? And if you now pause the video and try to think about this yourself, good luck. I don't recommend doing this. It's a really non-trivial question. And it's not easy to find those groups. And that's kind of this theorem. It's kind of a collection about statements about those groups, growth of groups, very complicated, growth of groups, proved by many people. And let's go through it. So the first one is a little bit boring. It doesn't depend on the Cayley graph. Okay, fine. And the second one is constant growth happens if and only if the group is finite. That's kind of obvious if you want. Polynomial growth, that's a non-trivial statement. It's sometimes called Gromov theorem. Happens if and only if the group is what is called virtually nilpotent. So basically, you could think it's like the integers. So virtually nilpotent, a very strong condition the group needs to satisfy. And basically, every other group should grow exponentially. The correct statement here is, well, you can't really do an every other group grows exponentially statement. But what you can say is if a finitely generated group, then exponential is actually the worst. So exponential growth are really the big groups, polynomial growth are really the small groups. If you drop this finitely generated condition, of course, you can have everything you want because you can just put it in the number of generators if you want, but that's kind of a little bit boring. So for finitely generated, exponential is the worst. These are the big groups, polynomial are the small groups. And what about the intermediate? Well, the question was asked in the 60s and the answer took a while. So as I said, don't pause the video and try it yourself. You can, of course, but it's not easy. There really exists group of intermediate growths, and they're really hard and not well understood. I will come back to this picture in a second. So I will try to explain a certain group generated by A, B, C, and D. So here's the A, here's the B, here's the C, here's the D, and this group has intermediate growths. Coming back to that in a second, let me just finish the rest here. So as far as it's concerned here in 2022, the whole picture is not really understood. So groups of intermediate growths are still a bit scary and usually not easy to handle. So there's this conjecture that, for example, you cannot have a finitely presented group of intermediate growths. So this group here, for example, is finitely presented. It doesn't have any relations at all. So presented refers to the number of relations. It doesn't have any relations at all. So it's certainly finitely presented. These groups are finitely presented. So the only relation you have here is just commutativity. So it looks very finitely presented. This group here, which we'll see in a second again, is not finitely presented. And even stronger, the conjecture is that all intermediate growth groups cannot have a finite presentation. So I said again, if you have paused the video and tried to do it yourself, this is not easy. It's a conjecture kind of says that this is really not easy. At least I would first try some nice group that I can write down with a finite presentation. But apparently that's not possible. That's what the conjecture says. Okay, the group here, let me go to the last slide. This is one of intermediate growth. Here are the Cayley graphs of this crazy group. And as you can see, it slowly gets a bit crazy. It doesn't look as symmetric as the other ones. And counting here is also non-trivial. So here I'm talking about really serious papers proving those results that we will discuss in a second. The group is called the Grigorchuk group. And all, as far as I know, all groups of intermediate growth are kind of variations of the known ones, of course, are variations of this group. So I say it again, all known groups of intermediate growth are variations of this Grigorchuk group. So the Cayley graph is kind of, it's also kind of fractal. So this is a certain iteration and another iteration. So you can see this little piece here sitting in the previous one, like here. So not including the outmost vertices, and it goes on and on and on and on. So what is this mysterious group? Well, let's go back. It's actually an automorphism of an infinite binary tree, and it's generated by a certain type of automorphisms. The first one is kind of the easiest one, is A. So here's something, God knows what it is. Here's something, the remaining parts of the tree, and operation A just swaps the two branches. That's operation A. Operation B does something a little bit crazier. So for operation B, you have here this little picture that it spreads, and no spread, spreads, and no spread, and so on. And it always permutes those two. And operation C is similar, just that this guy here moves to the next slot, right? And operation D is similar. So it's really, these are automorphisms of binary tree. All of them are of order 2. That's easy to see because they just swap certain branches. But the interactions between them is pretty complicated. So if you look at this graph, that's the interaction. So let's try to at least understand it roughly. So here's the origin, the little black dot. And I should have 4 colored outgoing edges because I have 4 elements here, and they should be all of order 2. And then you can see it here. So here's a blue edge, a green edge, Sion type edge, and a red edge. And in each vertex you have those, and this is then the Cayley graph. Already pretty complicated beast. And it's non-trivial to show that this group is of intermediate growth. These are the bounds I found. It might have been already improved. So basically the growth is in between something like x of n to the 0.504, so a little bit better than x of n of square root of n. And here is something like 0.77 or something. And that's intermediate growth. So let me show you actually why this is intermediate growth. So here's very silly Mathematica code. It just plots 3 functions. There's nothing very special. The first one, the blue one, is n squared. That's polynomial rows. The last one, the greenish one, is x of n. That's certainly exponential growth. It goes away. And this one is the intermediate growth one. It's a lower bound for the Grigor group growth. So 0.504. And it's this orange line. So I did here, I plotted those up to n equals 1,000. And as you can see, the orange line actually takes a while to get over the, the blue one, so over the polynomial one, but eventually it will be of intermediate growth. So as you can see, this goes exponentially. This one is in this picture a line, because let me come back to it in a second. In this picture, this is a line, and this is not a line, but it also doesn't grow exponentially, so it's really intermediate growth. So if you can see here, in order to even make it visible, I used the log plot. So the x grows so fast that you wouldn't be able to see anything if I would remove the log plot here. Anyway, the point is you have exponential growth, you have polynomial growth, and this intermediate type of growth, which in this case, I just choose the lower bound for the Grigor growth. I said again, this is not trivial to prove. As you can see, a simple counting argument, just drawing these little circles and then count. I don't know, those graphs look very complicated to me. Anyway, this was a video about growth of groups. It's kind of a cool notion, like how many elements you can produce in a group from a certain distance of the origin in the Cayley graph. So basically how many words can you find up to a certain length? And we had, well, polynomial constant growth. So these are kind of the small ones. And then there was the exponential growth, like the free group. And they're kind of relatively well understood. And then there's this very strange class of intermediate growth groups, like the Grigor group, which is just complicated. Let's just say they're just complicated, but still very beautiful, of course. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed the video, and I also hope to see you next time.